Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in the history of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the shadow of the ancient Blue Ridge Mountains, a weathered structure once stood as a monument to hospitality. The Wynn Inn, established in 1878, was positioned on a steep incline overlooking the town of Blacksburg, Virginia. While the passing traveler might have viewed it as merely another place to lay their head, locals knew better than to recommend it to visitors they held in any regard. The three-story Victorian edifice, with its imposing gables and wraparound porch, had earned a peculiar reputation among those who lived in its vicinity, not for any specific incident that could be recounted, but rather for the persistent sense of unease that seemed to emanate from behind its lace curtains and ornately carved doors. In 1904, what began as a simple maintenance inspection would reveal a series of discoveries that would change the understanding of the inn's history forever. What authorities found behind the meticulously papered walls and underneath the ornate carpets would raise questions about every single guest who had checked in over the preceding 26 years. According to county records, the subsequent investigation was quietly concluded in 1968 and sealed by federal order, the files reportedly destroyed in an office fire that same year. Yet fragments of the truth have emerged over decades, pieced together from personal correspondence, unofficial journals, and the occasional slip of the tongue from those who were sworn to silence. This is the documented account of the Wynn Inn and the terrible secrets contained within its walls. The building itself was an imposing three-story Victorian structure, featuring a wraparound porch and 22 rooms for guests. Each room had been furnished with what appeared to be carefully selected antiques, though as later investigation would reveal, these furnishings were far from arbitrary in their placement or design. The inn was situated at a crossroads where the main stagecoach route from Richmond met the newer rail connection to the coal mining regions further west. This position ensured a steady flow of travelers, businessmen, government officials, and occasionally families relocating to the promising territories beyond the mountains. It was owned and operated by the Wynn family, specifically Thaddeus Wynn, who had inherited the property from his father, the original builder. Thaddeus was described by those who knew him as a meticulous man of medium height, with a carefully trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they observed. His manner was unfailingly polite, yet guests often remarked on his habit of appearing silently when least expected, at the end of corridors, in the shadows of the dining room, or sometimes standing motionless in the garden at unusual hours, seemingly lost in contemplation. The inn maintained a respectable reputation among the business class of travelers, situated as it was at the crossroads of several important trading routes through the mountains. Its rates were reasonable, its accommodations clean, and its dining room served acceptable, if unremarkable fare. Nothing about its exterior operation suggested anything beyond the ordinary business of hospitality. What made the Wynn Inn different from other establishments in the area was its policy of meticulous record-keeping. Thaddeus Wynn kept detailed ledgers of every guest who ever stayed at the inn. Their names, occupations, destinations, and even personal habits were all recorded in careful, flowing script. These ledgers, discovered later, would become central to understanding what truly happened at the Wynn Inn. The level of detail went far beyond what would be necessary for the operation of a simple country inn, with notations about guests' sleeping habits, food preferences, and even fragments of overheard conversations dutifully recorded. On April 17, 1904, a plumber named James Harrington was called to the inn to address a persistent issue with water pressure on the third floor. The problem had been reported by several guests over the preceding weeks, with complaints that the water would sometimes stop entirely, only to resume with unexpected force minutes later. Harrington, who had serviced the inn's plumbing on several occasions over the years, suspected a blockage in one of the main pipes that ran through the walls between rooms 17 and 18. What he discovered in the crawl space between these rooms would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Virginia's history, one that would remain largely unreported in newspapers and deliberately kept from public knowledge. According to Harrington's grandson, who spoke to a local historian in 1962, the plumber rarely discussed the events of that day, but when he did, it was with a sense of profound disquiet that never left him until his death in 1931. Harrington's written statement, filed with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, describes how he accessed the narrow space between the walls to inspect the pipes. The wallpaper had been removed in one section, he wrote, and there appeared to be writing on the plaster underneath. When I held my lantern closer, I could make out what looked like a list of dates and initials, along with other markings I couldn't decipher. The writing was not in a single hand, but appeared to be the work of multiple individuals, some portions neatly printed, while others were scratched hastily, as if in great agitation or under severe time constraints. This discovery might have been dismissed as the scribblings of previous workers, except that Harrington noticed something else, a small metal box embedded in the wall. The box had been plastered over and then concealed behind the wallpaper, but the recent water damage had caused the plaster to crumble, revealing its presence. It was securely locked, but appeared to be of recent manufacture, rather than an artifact left behind during the inn's construction. When opened by Sheriff Thomas Blackwood several hours later, the box contained a folded piece of paper with a detailed diagram of the inn, with particular attention paid to room 17. On the diagram, specific areas of the floorboards were marked with red ink. Notations in the margins referred to observation points, auditory channels, and influence markers, terms that meant little to the sheriff at the time, but would take on disturbing significance as the investigation progressed. When Sheriff Thomas Blackwood arrived to investigate, he made the decision to examine the floorboards in question. This required the temporary relocation of the room's current occupant, a traveling pharmaceutical salesman named George Porter, who expressed considerable annoyance at the disruption, but was eventually persuaded to move to another room for the evening. Porter would later be extensively interviewed as part of the investigation, though his statements were among those sealed by federal authorities. Beneath the marked floorboards, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, they discovered a leather-bound journal belonging to Eleanor Wynn, Thaddeus's wife, who had reportedly died from tuberculosis 3 years earlier in 1901. The official cause of death had never been questioned, as tuberculosis was common enough in the region, and Eleanor had been known to suffer from a persistent cough in the years preceding her death. No physician had been present at her passing, and her body had been quickly interred in the family plot behind the inn, with only Thaddeus and a handful of staff in attendance. The journal's contents would never be fully revealed to the public, but according to Deputy Walter Collins, whose personal papers were donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1952, what they read that day prompted an immediate and thorough search of the entire building. "I have never seen the sheriff so disturbed by anything in all my years of service," Collins wrote in a letter to his brother. He ordered the inn closed immediately, and all guests relocated to other accommodations in town. When questioned about this unusual action, he would say only that it was a matter of public safety, and that explanations would be forthcoming when appropriate. The search of the Wynn Inn would continue for 17 days. During this time, Thaddeus Wynn was nowhere to be found, having left for a business trip to Richmond the day before the plumber's discovery. A telegraph was sent, but Wynn never arrived at his stated destination. His disappearance added another layer to the growing mystery, with some speculating that he had been tipped off about the investigation, perhaps by an accomplice among the local authorities or the inn's staff. The staff themselves were interviewed extensively. The inn employed 8 individuals, a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, a stable hand, a handyman, a clerk, and a porter. All claimed limited knowledge of any unusual activities at the establishment, though several admitted to finding certain aspects of their employment strange. The cook, Margaret Wilson, stated that Thaddeus Wynn had specific requirements for meals served to guests in particular rooms, requirements that sometimes involved unusual ingredients or preparations that varied according to some system she couldn't discern. One of the maids, Sarah Jenkins, reported that she had been instructed never to clean room 17 unless specifically directed to do so by Thaddeus himself, and even then, only under his direct supervision. The handyman, Robert Taylor, admitted to installing various modifications to the rooms over the years, but claimed he had simply followed Wynn's detailed instructions without questioning their purpose. As investigators moved methodically through the inn, they discovered that nearly every room contained hidden compartments, secret panels, or unusual modifications. In room 8, the floorboard had been designed to be removed and replaced without showing any evidence of disturbance. The space beneath contained what appeared to be acoustic equipment, early listening devices connected to small tubes that ran through the walls. In room 14, the back of the wardrobe opened it into a concealed observation space, just large enough for a person to stand in darkness while observing the room's occupant through tiny holes drilled in the wardrobe's ornate carvings. Room 22 featured a complex system of speaking tubes, allowing conversations to be heard from the proprietor's office on the first floor. These tubes had been cleverly disguised within the room's decorative elements, behind a painting, within a bedpost, and under the writing desk. The degree of engineering skill involved in these modifications suggested both considerable expense and expertise far beyond what might be expected of a country innkeeper. But it was room 17 that contained the most disturbing elements. The room itself appeared ordinary at first glance, a comfortable bed with a carved headboard, a writing desk positioned near the window, a wardrobe against one wall, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. Closer examination, however, revealed that every element of the room had been carefully designed to influence its occupants in subtle ways. The floorboards were spaced at intervals that created a barely perceptible unevenness, causing visitors to maintain a slight but constant state of physical imbalance. The angle of the writing desk forced anyone sitting at it to maintain an uncomfortable posture that would induce physical tension over time. The window glass had been subtly distorted, altering the quality of light entering the room in ways that would gradually affect mood and perception. Behind the headboard of the bed, investigators found a hidden compartment containing personal effects that appeared to belong to at least 7 different individuals. These items included pocket watches, wedding rings, correspondence, and identification papers. None of these individuals had ever been reported missing, yet, according to the inn's ledgers, each had stayed in room 17 at some point between 1892 and 1903. The ledger entries for these guests included unusual notations: subject responsive to auditory stimuli during delta phase, subject exhibits heightened suggestibility following method C application, and subject integration nearly complete, ready for final phase. The most puzzling discovery was a series of leather-bound books found in a locked chest in Thaddeus Wynn's private office. These books contained detailed accounts of guests, not just their names and occupations, but intimate details about their lives, habits, and personalities. The information was far more extensive than what could be gathered during a brief stay at an inn. Entries described childhood experiences, private fears, ambitions, and relationships that guests could not reasonably have disclosed during their stay. More disturbing was the fact that many entries contained information about guests before they had even arrived at the establishment, suggesting a network of surveillance that extended far beyond the inn itself. According to records from the investigation, Thaddeus Wynn had maintained correspondence with innkeepers and hoteliers throughout the eastern seaboard, creating what appeared to be an extensive network for sharing information about travelers. Letters found in his office referenced a mutual endeavor and shared observations that pointed to a coordinated effort involving dozens of establishments. This network, investigators theorized, allowed Wynn to know precisely who would be arriving at his establishment and what potential value they might represent. But value for what purpose remained unclear. No bodies were found on the premises, and no guests were ever confirmed to have met with foul play at the Wynn Inn. Yet the evidence suggested a systematic operation of surveillance and possible exploitation that had continued for decades. The absence of clear physical harm to guests made the case all the more perplexing. What exactly was Thaddeus Wynn attempting to achieve with his elaborate system of observation and manipulation? The investigation took an unexpected turn when authorities discovered a hidden room in the basement of the inn, accessible only through a narrow passage behind the coal chute. The room contained a desk, a chair, and walls lined with filing cabinets. Inside these cabinets were hundreds of folders, each labeled with a guest's name and the date of their stay. The folders contained detailed observational notes, often accompanied by small items. A strand of hair, nail clippings, or torn fragments of clothing, items that could have been collected during routine cleaning of the rooms, but had instead been preserved as specimens. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, a physician from Roanoke who assisted in the investigation, noted in his private journal that the contents of these folders suggested an unprecedented level of psychological manipulation. The detailed observations of behavior, the personal information gathered without consent, the strategic placement of certain objects in rooms to elicit specific emotional responses, all point to a methodical study of human psychology for purposes I dare not speculate upon in writing. Whitaker was particularly disturbed by a series of notebooks that outlined what appeared to be experimental protocols. These describe systematic methods for inducing specific emotional and psychological states in subjects without their awareness, he wrote. Techniques for disrupting sleep patterns, inducing mild disorientation, and heightening susceptibility to suggestion through environmental manipulation. Most disturbing is the clinical tone. These were not the actions of a madman, but the calculated procedures of someone conducting what they clearly viewed as legitimate scientific research. The investigation was abruptly halted on May 11, 1904, when federal authorities arrived and took possession of all materials found in the inn. According to limited records, the case was deemed a matter of national security, though no explanation for this classification was ever provided. Local law enforcement was instructed to cease all inquiries, and those who had participated in the investigation were required to sign confidentiality agreements under threat of prosecution. The Wynn Inn was boarded up, and a notice of condemnation was posted. Within 6 months, the building was destroyed in a fire that local firefighters were instructed not to combat. The official report cited faulty electrical wiring as the cause, though electricity had not yet been installed in the building. This obvious contradiction went unchallenged in official records, a fact that many later pointed to as evidence of a deliberate cover-up. For decades, the story of the Wynn Inn faded from public memory, mentioned only in hushed conversations among the oldest residents of Blacksburg. The land where the inn once stood remained undeveloped, avoided by locals who claimed the ground itself had been tainted by whatever occurred there. Travelers passing through the area would sometimes inquire about accommodations near the crossroads, only to be directed to establishments much further away without explanation. In 1938, a University of Virginia graduate student named Margaret Holbrook became interested in the story while researching the history of hospitality in the Blue Ridge region. Her inquiries met with unusual resistance from local officials and residents alike. "No one wants to discuss the old Wynn place," as she wrote in her research notes. "When I mention it, conversations end abruptly, and people find reasons to be elsewhere." One elderly woman crossed herself and refused to speak to me further, while a local businessman who had initially seemed helpful abruptly claimed he had no knowledge of any such establishment, despite having mentioned it by name minutes earlier. Undeterred, Holbrook pursued the story through official channels, filing requests for information with various government agencies. Most of these requests were denied, but in 1941 she received a partial response from the Department of the Interior that included several pages of redacted documents related to the Wynn Inn investigation. These heavily censored materials provided little concrete information but confirmed that the federal government had indeed been involved in the case and continued to maintain an interest in keeping the details confidential nearly 4 decades later. Among these documents was a memo dated June 3, 1904, from an unnamed federal agent to his superior. The memo stated, "The methods employed at the Wynn establishment represent an advancement in behavioral study that, while morally reprehensible, may have applications for our ongoing work. Recommend full containment of all information and acquisition of relevant materials for further analysis." The remainder of the document had been redacted, with no indication of which government department had authored it or what ongoing work might have benefited from Wynn's methods. Holbrook's research was interrupted by World War II, and she never returned to the project. Her notes and the documents she had gathered were stored in the university archives, largely forgotten until 1967, when Professor James Thornton discovered them while researching a book on unusual criminal cases in Virginia's history. Thornton, a criminologist with an interest in the psychological aspects of criminal behavior, recognized the potential significance of the Wynn Inn case as an early example of systematic psychological manipulation. Thornton's interest in the Wynn Inn case led him to track down Walter Collins, the former deputy who had participated in the original investigation. By then an elderly man living in a nursing home in Lynchburg, Collins was initially reluctant to discuss the case. "Some things are best left buried," he reportedly told Thornton during their first meeting. "Not because they're dead, but because they're still alive in ways you wouldn't understand." The Wynn business didn't end when the inn burned down. It just went deeper underground. After several visits, however, Collins began to share details of what he had witnessed in 1904. According to Thornton's notes, Collins revealed that the investigation had discovered evidence suggesting that Thaddeus Wynn had been conducting a form of psychological experimentation on his guests, studying how small environmental changes could influence behavior and emotional states. Each room was designed to elicit specific responses, Collins is quoted as saying. The positioning of furniture, the colors of the walls, even the spacing of floorboards, everything was calculated. Wynn would make small changes between guests' stays and record the differences in their behavior. Some rooms were designed to induce melancholy, others to provoke anger or fear. Room 17 was reserved for what Wynn called the culmination, though what that meant we never determined. Collins described how guests who stayed in certain rooms would report unusual dreams or inexplicable mood changes. A businessman who was known for his even temperament became irrationally angry during a 3-night stay in room 9, he said. A woman who had never shown any signs of nervous disposition suffered from paralyzing anxiety after spending just 1 night in room 14. These effects sometimes persisted long after the guests had departed, as we discovered when attempting to contact previous patrons during our investigation. Collins also revealed that Eleanor Wynn's journal contained disturbing accounts of her husband's gradual transformation from a curious observer of human nature to an obsessive manipulator. She wrote about how he would stay awake all night, listening through the speaking tubes to guests' conversations, their moments of private despair or joy, Collins said. He seemed particularly interested in dreams. He had devised methods to influence what people dreamed about while staying at the inn. According to Collins, Eleanor had initially supported her husband's interest in human behavior, even assisting in his early observations. But as his methods became more intrusive and manipulative, she began to express concerns. Her journal entries from the year before her death described increasing fear of her husband and suspicion that she herself had become one of his subjects. "I find my thoughts turning in directions that do not feel like my own," she wrote in one entry that Collins quoted from memory. "I wonder if the tea he insists on preparing for me each night contains more than the herbal remedy he claims." The most troubling revelation from Collins concerned the network of innkeepers with whom Wynn corresponded. According to Collins, the investigation uncovered evidence suggesting this network extended far beyond information sharing. These weren't just innkeepers, he said, doctors, lawyers, government officials. They were all part of it. They called themselves the Observatory. They believed they were creating a science of human behavior, something they could use to control people. The Observatory, as described in the correspondence, viewed their work as pioneering research that would eventually allow for the systematic influence of human behavior on a societal scale. They shared techniques, results, and subjects, directing certain travelers to each other's establishments for continued observation and experimentation. Their letters referred to a graduated protocol that would begin with subtle environmental manipulations and progress to more direct interventions in the subject's psychological state. Thornton's research into the Wynn Inn case ended as abruptly as the original investigation. In January 1968, while driving to an interview with another potential witness, his car went off the road near the old Wynn property. His body was recovered, but his research materials were never found. The official report listed the cause of death as a heart attack while driving, resulting in the accident. No autopsy was performed despite requests from Thornton's colleagues at the university, who noted that he had no history of heart problems and had passed a physical examination just 2 months earlier. That same year, a small fire in the Montgomery County Records Office destroyed numerous files, including all remaining documentation related to the Wynn Inn investigation. The university archives, where Margaret Holbrook's materials were stored, suffered a break-in, with her collection among the only items taken. Walter Collins passed away in his sleep 1 week after his final meeting with Thornton, leaving no written account of his experiences beyond what Thornton had already documented. The story might have ended there, lost to time and deliberate erasure, if not for a discovery made in 1965 during the construction of a new highway through the Blue Ridge Mountains, approximately 20 miles from the former site of the Wynn Inn. This chronological departure from the narrative's sequence represents information that came to light only after Thornton had begun his research, contributing to his determination to uncover the full story despite growing resistance. Workers excavating the hillside for the roadbed uncovered a small cave entrance that had been sealed with stones. Inside, they found a leather trunk containing papers, books, and personal effects belonging to Thaddeus Wynn. Among these items was a journal describing in clinical detail what he called the Grand Experiment. The journal had evidently been hidden in the months following his disappearance in 1904, perhaps with the intention of retrieving it at a later date, an intention never fulfilled. According to limited accounts from workers who saw the contents before authorities confiscated them, Wynn's writings revealed that the inn had been designed from the beginning as a laboratory for studying human behavior under controlled conditions. Each room represented a different experimental environment, carefully crafted to test specific hypotheses about emotional and psychological responses. The journal contained architectural drawings showing how the structure had been modified over time, with new elements added as Wynn refined his techniques. More disturbing were Wynn's notes about graduated exposure, a process by which he would incrementally increase the intensity of the psychological stimuli applied to returning guests, measuring their changing responses over time. Returning travelers were particularly valued subjects as they allowed for longitudinal studies of the effectiveness of various techniques. Room 17, it seemed, was where guests who had stayed multiple times would eventually be placed, exposed to the culmination of Wynn's manipulations. In this room, according to fragments of information that emerged from those who had seen the journal, Wynn attempted to achieve what he called complete environmental control. a state in which every aspect of a subject's experience, from sensory input to emotional response, could be directed without their knowledge or consent. The specific techniques employed remain unclear, but the workers who discovered the trunk described diagrams of the room that showed complex modifications to lighting, airflow, sound transmission, and even the chemical composition of materials used in furnishings. What exactly happened to guests in room 17 remains unclear. No definitive evidence of murder was ever found, yet the personal effects discovered behind the headboard suggest that at least some individuals never left the inn, or if they did, they left without their most valuable and personal possessions. Wynn's journal reportedly contained entries about terminal subjects who had completed the protocol, but whether this referred to death, some form of psychological breaking point, or something else entirely, could not be determined from the fragments of information that escaped the government's containment efforts. The materials found in the cave were quickly confiscated by federal agents, and the cave itself was sealed and its location obscured by the continuing highway construction. The workers who made the discovery were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, though rumors of what they had found circulated in local communities for years afterward. One worker, who spoke anonymously to a local newspaper reporter in 1967, claimed that the agents who confiscated the materials were not from any agency he recognized. Not FBI, not local police. These men didn't identify themselves at all. They just showed some kind of credentials that made the foreman step back and let them take everything without argument. One persistent rumor concerned a map found among Wynn's possessions, reportedly showing the locations of other inns throughout the country that were part of the observatory network. If such a map existed, it has never been made public, leaving open the possibility that the Wynn Inn was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger operation. This possibility takes on disturbing implications when considered alongside the federal government's evident interest in concealing information about the case and potentially preserving Wynn's research methods for their own applications. In 1969, a former guest of the Wynn Inn came forward with an account of his stay there in 1902. Harold Simmons, then a traveling salesman, recalled his 3-night stay in room 12 with remarkable clarity. "I've never slept so poorly in my life," he stated in a recorded interview with local historian Evelyn Porter. "Each night I was plagued by the most vivid nightmares, not the usual nonsense of dreams, but methodical scenarios of being observed, studied, my most private thoughts laid bare." Simmons described how certain features of the room seemed to change between when he left in the morning and returned in the evening. The wardrobe was perhaps an inch closer to the bed, the window shade set at a slightly different height. Small things that made me question my own perception. At first, I thought perhaps the maid had moved things during cleaning, but when I mentioned it casually to Mr. Wynn, he assured me that staff had been instructed never to rearrange guests' rooms. His response was oddly detailed for such a simple question, as if he had prepared it in advance. The salesman also noted unusual sounds that seemed to emanate from within the walls, not the typical settling noises of an old building, but rhythmic tapping that would begin precisely at midnight and continue until approximately 2:17 each morning. "I timed it with my pocket watch," he said. "The regularity was what disturbed me most. Nature isn't that precise, which meant it was human. Someone or something was creating those sounds deliberately, though to what purpose I couldn't imagine." On the final night of his stay, Simmons awoke to find Thaddeus Wynn sitting in the chair in the corner of his room, simply watching him. When I asked what he was doing, he apologized most profusely, claiming that he had confused the rooms while checking on another guest who had requested a late-night remedy for indigestion. But his eyes, they held no embarrassment or surprise at being discovered. They were calculating, as if my reaction was exactly what he had come to observe. Simmons checked out the following morning and never returned to the area until decades later, when news of Professor Thornton's research reached him through an old colleague. His account provides one of the few first-hand descriptions of Wynn's methods from someone who recognized, at least partially, what was occurring. Most guests, it seems, either noticed nothing unusual or attributed any strange experiences to the typical discomforts of travel or their own tired minds. Another account came from Emily Patterson, who had worked briefly as a maid at the inn in 1899. In a letter to her sister, discovered among family papers in 1966, Patterson described how Thaddeus Wynn would interview potential employees extensively before hiring them, asking questions about their sleep habits, their ability to keep secrets, and whether they were troubled by dreams. He seemed almost disappointed when I told him I rarely remember my dreams, she wrote. It was as if he was looking for some quality in me that I didn't possess. Patterson's letter described her growing unease with certain aspects of her employment. Mr. Wynn has very specific instructions about how rooms are to be prepared, she wrote. The angle of the mirrors, the placement of the lamps, even how the bedsheets are to be folded, all must be done exactly as he directs. When I suggested a more efficient method of turning down the beds, he became quite stern and said that any deviation from his instructions would contaminate the environment. It was an odd choice of words, more like what a doctor might say about a surgical room than an innkeeper about guest accommodations. After 3 weeks of employment, Patterson was assigned to Clean Room 17 under Wynn's supervision. He stood in the doorway watching my every move, her letter recounted. The room itself seemed ordinary enough, though there was a heaviness to the air that made it difficult to breathe comfortably. As I dusted the writing desk, I noticed small holes drilled into the underside, too neat to be wormholes, and too deliberate to be flaws in the wood. When I bent to examine them more closely, Mr. Wynn quickly directed my attention elsewhere, asking me to focus on cleaning the mirror according to his precise instructions. Patterson left her position the following day, claiming a family emergency. In her letter, she admitted this was a fabrication. I could not bear another day in that place. There is something wrong there, something I cannot name but feel in my very bones. Mr. Wynn watches us all, not just the guests, but the staff as well. I feel we are all part of some experiment whose purpose I dare not contemplate. The most recent development in the Wynn case came in 1968, when an anonymous donor provided the Virginia Historical Society with a collection of letters purportedly written by members of the observatory between 1890 and 1903. The authenticity of these letters has never been conclusively established, but they contain discussions of psychological experiments conducted at various establishments throughout the country, with the Wynn Inn frequently mentioned as an exemplary model. The timing of this donation, coinciding with Professor Thornton's research and subsequent death, has led some to speculate that the letters may have been provided by someone with knowledge of the original investigation, who wished to ensure that some record of the observatory survived the apparent efforts to erase it from history. These letters outline a philosophy that viewed traditional morality as an impediment to scientific advancement. To truly understand the human mind, one letter states, we must be willing to observe it under conditions of extreme duress, in moments of profound emotional and psychological disturbance. Only then can we map the true boundaries of consciousness and perhaps extend beyond them. The writer goes on to argue that obtaining consent from subjects would invalidate the results, as awareness of being observed would alter behavior in ways that would render the data useless. The correspondence refers to various establishments throughout the eastern United States that had been modified to serve as observation posts, hotels, inns, and boarding houses, where travelers could be studied without their knowledge. These locations had apparently been selected for their isolation, the transient nature of their clientele, and the ease with which they could be modified to include observation spaces and environmental controls. The Wynn Inn was described as the most advanced of our facilities, capable of environmental modulations of unprecedented subtlety. The letters also make reference to a culmination, that was to occur at the Wynn Inn in the autumn of 1904, an event described as the final synthesis of our collective work, the demonstration that will validate our methods and secure our legacy. What this culmination might have entailed remains unknown, as the discovery of the hidden writings in April of that year apparently disrupted whatever had been planned. One letter, dated March 1904, mentions preparations for the arrival of the delegation and the need for subjects at various stages of the protocol to be present for observation. Perhaps most disturbing are the references to permanent acquisitions, individuals who had been selected for continuous study based on their particular responsiveness to the techniques employed. These subjects were apparently transferred between different facilities within the network, their disappearances explained through various means that would prevent inquiry, changes of employment, fictional family emergencies, or opportunities too good to refuse in distant locations. Whether these acquisitions were maintained under some form of psychological control or physical confinement is not clear from the available fragments of correspondence. Today, the land where the Wynn Inn once stood remains undeveloped, a grassy field bordered by trees that have reclaimed the edges of the property. No marker indicates the significance of the site, and most residents of the area are unaware of its history. The road that once led travelers to its doors has long since been rerouted, and the crossroads it served now features a modern gas station and a convenience store. Occasionally, historians or curious locals visit the site, but there is little to see. No foundation remains visible. No artifacts have surfaced despite decades of natural erosion. Yet something of the Wynn Inn's legacy persists in the academic literature of psychology and behavioral science. Certain methodologies for studying environmental effects on emotional states bear striking similarities to Wynn's techniques, though without attribution. Concepts that appear in Wynn's writings as described by those who saw them emerged decades later in mainstream psychological theory, presented as new discoveries rather than the continuation of a darker lineage. Terms like environmental priming, unconscious behavioral modification, and context-dependent emotional response entered the scientific lexicon in the mid-20th century, describing phenomena that Thaddeus Wynn had apparently been studying systematically at the turn of the century. The historical gap between Wynn's work and the emergence of these concepts in academic literature coincides with periods of government-funded research into psychological manipulation, including projects that were later partially declassified and acknowledged to have involved unethical experimentation on unwitting subjects. Whether these programs had access to Wynn's research methods cannot be definitively established, but the parallels are difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. One must wonder how many other such establishments existed as part of the observatory network, and whether their influence continues to shape our understanding of the human mind in ways we do not recognize. More troubling still is the question of how many travelers checked into rooms designed to manipulate their most intimate thoughts and emotions, never realizing they had become unwitting subjects in an experiment of unknown purpose and design. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the possibility that the techniques pioneered in these establishments did not die with their discoverers, but were preserved, refined, and applied in contexts far beyond a remote inn in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The full truth of the Wynn Inn may never be known. The deliberate destruction of records, the confiscation of evidence by federal authorities, and the passing of those who witnessed its operation firsthand have ensured that much of its history remains speculative. What can be said with certainty is that within those walls, a man named Thaddeus Wynn conducted a systematic study of human psychology through methods that violated every principle of ethical research and perhaps basic human decency. The extent of harm caused to those who stayed at the inn cannot be fully quantified, but the fragments of evidence that have survived suggest that at least some guests left with psychological wounds that never healed, alterations to their perceptions, emotions, and behaviors that persisted long after they had returned to their normal lives. A revealing account comes from the family of William Garrett, a lumber merchant who stayed at the Wynn Inn for 3 nights in October of 1899. According to letters written by his wife Sarah to her sister, Garrett returned from his business trip fundamentally changed in ways she struggled to articulate. "It is as if a shadow has fallen across his mind," she wrote. "He startles at small sounds, stands for hours staring at blank walls, and sometimes speaks to empty corners of rooms as if addressing someone only he can see." Garrett's condition deteriorated over the following months. He abandoned his previously successful business, became increasingly isolated from friends and family, and eventually was committed to Western State Hospital in Staunton, where he remained until his death in 1912. His medical records, reviewed by a researcher in 1963, contain repeated references to his insistence that he was still in the room and under observation. The attending physician attributed these delusions to general paranoia, unaware of their potential connection to Garrett's stay at the Wynn Inn years earlier. Similar cases emerged when Professor Thornton began tracking down former guests as part of his research. Those he was able to locate often exhibited unusual psychological patterns, persistent nightmares, inexplicable phobias, or behavioral changes that had begun shortly after their stay at the inn. Many reported a lingering sense of being watched, even decades later, and some described recurring dreams of returning to a room they couldn't quite identify, but that filled them with inexplicable dread. The most disturbing aspect of the Wynn Inn case is not what we know, but what remains hidden: the contents of Room 17, the nature of the culmination, the extent of the observatory network, and the possible application of Wynn's methods by government agencies who saw value in his morally reprehensible work. The deliberate obscuration of evidence suggests that someone recognized the potential power of these techniques and sought to control access to them, rather than exposing and condemning them as the violations they were. Several researchers who attempted to investigate the case in the decades following the initial discovery encountered similar patterns of obstruction. Files would be misplaced just before their scheduled visits to archives. Individuals who had previously agreed to interviews would suddenly refuse all contact. Photographs of the inn would disappear from collections where they had been reliably cataloged for years. These incidents could be dismissed as coincidences or the natural challenges of historical research, except for their consistent association with this particular case and their unusual frequency. The journalist Marion Hayes, who attempted to write an article about the Wynn Inn for a national magazine in 1959, described her experience in a private letter to a colleague. "It's as if the story doesn't want to be told. Every lead evaporates upon examination. People who should have knowledge claim ignorance or refuse to speak. Documents that should exist have vanished. I've never encountered such systematic resistance in all my years of investigative reporting. It feels almost like I'm being observed as I conduct my investigation, my approaches anticipated and countered before I even make them." In 1968, Professor Thornton wrote in his notes, just days before his fatal accident, "I cannot escape the feeling that the Wynn Inn was merely the visible portion of something far larger and more pervasive. The deeper I dig, the more I sense that I am not discovering a forgotten history, but intruding upon an ongoing operation that never truly ended with the closing of the inn. The techniques have evolved, the locations have changed, but the fundamental approach remains: the systematic observation and manipulation of human behavior without consent, conducted under the guise of ordinary environments that conceal their true purpose. This observation takes on particular significance when considered alongside certain government programs that were later revealed to have conducted psychological experimentation during the mid-20th century. The timing of federal intervention in the Wynn Inn case and the specific interest in preserving rather than exposing its methods raises troubling questions about the potential adaptation of those methods for purposes beyond Thaddeus Wynn's original grand experiment. A document obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1976, heavily redacted but still revealing, references a historical acquisition of behavioral modification techniques from a private research initiative circa 1904 that formed the foundation for subsequent protocol development. The document goes on to note that these techniques were particularly valuable due to their environmental rather than chemical approach, allowing for application in non-controlled settings with minimal detection risk. While this document does not specifically name the Wynn Inn or Thaddeus Wynn, the date and description align with what is known about the case. These programs, some aspects of which have been declassified while others remain secret, employed methods of psychological manipulation that bear striking similarities to those described in accounts of the Wynn Inn's operation. If Wynn's techniques were indeed preserved and developed by government agencies, the implications extend far beyond the historical curiosity of a strange inn in the Virginia mountains. The ability to influence behavior and emotional states through environmental manipulation, refined over decades with the resources of federal funding, could represent a form of power that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, present but undetected in various contexts of daily life. Architectural historians who have studied the limited descriptions of the Wynn Inn's modifications have noted that certain features began appearing in institutional settings in the decades following the inn's destruction. Subtle elements of design that affect movement patterns, emotional responses, and cognitive processing without the awareness of those experiencing them. These elements can be found in government buildings, transportation hubs, and various public spaces, ostensibly implemented for aesthetic or practical purposes, but potentially serving less visible functions. Dr. Elizabeth Mercer, an architectural psychologist who reviewed the available information about the Wynn Inn in 1966, noted, "The genius of Wynn's approach, if the accounts are accurate, was in making the manipulative elements of the environment appear entirely ordinary. A slight asymmetry in room proportions, a barely perceptible incline in the flooring, the positioning of light sources to create subtle visual distortions, none of these would be noticed consciously, yet each would contribute to a cumulative effect on the occupant's psychological state. These principles appear to have been incorporated into various institutional designs throughout the mid-20th century, particularly in settings where influencing behavior would be advantageous to authorities. If you find yourself traveling through the Blue Ridge Mountains, passing near Blacksburg, Virginia, you might notice an unmarked turnoff from the highway, a narrow road that seems to lead nowhere, ending at an empty field surrounded by ancient oaks. Local legend holds that on certain nights, particularly in April, lights can be seen moving among the trees where the Wynn Inn once stood. Some claim these are merely the flashlights of curious trespassers, drawn by vague rumors of the site's significance. Others suggest something else entirely, that in some intangible way, the inn and its purposes remain, continuing to observe those who come seeking its secrets. A local resident, speaking anonymously to a folklorist in 1971, described his experience while hiking near the old inn site. "I had no intention of going there specifically. I was just following a deer trail and realized where I was only after I'd entered the clearing. It was late afternoon, the sun starting to set behind the mountains. I felt watched, not in an imaginative way, but in the very practical sense that I was being observed from multiple angles. The feeling was so strong that I called out, thinking perhaps other hikers were nearby. There was no response, but the sensation persisted. As I turned to leave, I noticed that I had been standing in what must have been the exact center of the original structure. You can still make out the foundation line if you know what to look for. I had the strangest thought then that I had been standing in room 17, and that somehow it was still there, not physically, but in some other way I can't quite explain. After all, as Thaddeus Wynn allegedly wrote in his final journal entry, "The true power of our work lies not in the manipulations themselves, but in the permanence of their effect. Long after the subject has departed our controlled environment, the changes we have initiated continue to develop, like a photograph slowly emerging in chemical solution. In this way, the room extends beyond its physical boundaries, existing wherever the subject goes, continuing its work without our direct intervention. The ultimate achievement would be an environment that perpetuates itself through those who have experienced it, a self-propagating influence that transfers from one subject to another through ordinary human interaction. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of the Wynn Inn is not what happened within its walls, but what left them, ideas and methods that spread outward, infiltrating legitimate institutions and practices in ways too subtle to detect, but too profound to dismiss. The inn itself may be gone, reduced to ash and then to memory, but the questions it raises about privacy, consent, and the vulnerability of the human mind to external influence remain as relevant today as they were in 1904. In the decades since the inn's destruction, our understanding of environmental psychology has advanced considerably. We now recognize that our surroundings influence our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways we rarely consciously perceive. The lighting, acoustics, spatial arrangements, and countless other features of our environment shape our experiences and responses, knowledge that is routinely applied in commercial, institutional, and even domestic settings. What separates this legitimate field of study from Wynn's methods is not the fundamental principle that environments affect psychology, but the matters of consent, transparency, and ethical purpose. The techniques pioneered at the Wynn Inn represented a dark application of this knowledge, using environmental manipulation not to enhance well-being or efficiency, but to exert control without awareness, to observe without consent, and to alter psychological states for purposes known only to the observer. That these techniques may have been preserved and developed rather than exposed and condemned represents a troubling chapter in the history of psychological research, one that continues to cast shadows into the present. Dr. Raymond Foster, a historian of psychology who has studied the limited available information about the Wynn Inn, observed in a 2017 interview, "The disturbing aspect of this case is not merely what was done to those unfortunate guests, but the suggestion that someone, whether government agencies or private interests, saw value in these methods and chose to develop rather than disavow them. If this indeed occurred, it represents a critical but largely unexamined branch in the evolution of applied psychology, one that operates in the shadows of legitimate research and influences aspects of contemporary practice in ways we may not fully recognize." In the words of Deputy Collins, spoken to Professor Thornton during their final meeting, "Some places change those who enter them in ways that can never be undone." I believe the Wynn Inn was such a place, not because of any supernatural quality, but because it was designed with exacting precision to alter the human mind. And the most frightening thought of all is that we may never know how many were changed, or in what ways, or to what end. Various accounts from the limited group of individuals who have researched the Wynn Inn case suggest a pattern of psychological disturbances that extend beyond what might be expected from investigating an unsettling historical incident. Marion Hayes reported increasing paranoia and insomnia as her research progressed, eventually abandoning her article entirely. Professor Thornton's colleagues noted his growing agitation and uncharacteristic secretiveness in the weeks before his death. Even Margaret Holbrook, whose interest in the case was relatively superficial, requested a change in her thesis topic shortly after receiving the redacted government documents, citing persistent nightmares and an inability to concentrate as her reasons. These experiences could be dismissed as the natural psychological effects of engaging with disturbing material, except for their consistency and the specific nature of the symptoms described. Several researchers reported the same peculiar sensation, a feeling that the boundaries of the room they occupied had somehow become permeable, that they were simultaneously in their own space and in another place they couldn't quite identify. This specific phenomenological experience, reported independently by individuals who had no contact with each other and in some cases were separated by decades, suggests a pattern that transcends coincidence. As night falls over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the empty field where the inn once stood lies quiet and seemingly unremarkable. But for those who know its history, the absence speaks as loudly as any presence, a deliberate erasure that raises more questions than it answers about what truly happened at the Wynn Inn and whether any room ever truly gave up all its secrets. The case of the Wynn Inn remains one of the most puzzling and disturbing episodes in the history of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A glimpse into practices that violated fundamental principles of human dignity and autonomy, conducted under the guise of scientific inquiry but divorced from ethical constraints. The true extent of its influence, both on those who unwittingly became its subjects and on subsequent developments in behavioral research, may never be fully known. What is certain is that for a period spanning at least 2 decades, travelers who sought nothing more than a night's rest at a remote mountain inn became unwitting participants in experiments designed to map and manipulate the boundaries of human consciousness. They checked into rooms that had been meticulously designed to influence their thoughts, emotions, and perceptions in ways they could neither detect nor resist. Some of these individuals may have left with subtle but permanent alterations to their psychological functioning, changes that followed them home like shadows, persisting long after they had forgotten the name and location of the establishment where the process began. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the possibility that the methods developed at the Wynn Inn did not end with its destruction, but were refined and applied in contexts we encounter in our daily lives, environments that shape our experiences and behaviors in ways we do not perceive, serving purposes we cannot identify, designed by individuals or institutions whose motives remain as obscure as those of Thaddeus Wynn himself. For in the final analysis, the true horror of the Wynn Inn was not that it was an aberration, a single disturbed individual conducting isolated experiments, but that it represented the visible portion of a larger system, a network of observation and manipulation that recognized the vulnerability of the human mind to environmental influence and exploited that vulnerability without regard for consent or consequence. And if such a system existed once in the guise of a remote country inn at the turn of the century, one must wonder what forms it might take today, hidden in plain sight amid the ordinary structures of contemporary life. The next time you find yourself in an unfamiliar room, perhaps in a hotel during business travel or visiting distant relatives, take a moment to consider the space around you. Notice the positioning of the furniture, the quality of the light, the subtle sounds that permeate the environment. Consider how these elements make you feel, how they might be influencing your thoughts and emotions in ways too subtle to immediately perceive. And perhaps, just perhaps, spare a thought for those who checked into room 17 at the Wynn Inn, never suspecting that the very space around them had been designed as an instrument of psychological manipulation, a room that, in some intangible way, they might never truly leave.